Okay, so if you've managed to stumble across this video, hi, I'm Sarah. I'm very glad to have you here, but it's most likely because you are also a reader. So today I'm gonna go through the 15 books that I read in March. Now 15 is high even for me. Like the last few months I've been reading about 10 books a month. However, this month I specifically was focusing on some shorter reads because I was participating in the Trans Rights Readathon. So a lot of the books were much shorter or much quicker paced than what I would normally select. So I was able to squeeze out 5 more books this month than the last few months. I am going to speak to each one of the 15 books that I read this month from least favorite to most favorite, or at least like my group of most favorite books from this month. I'm not entirely sure if I could pick a favorite from this month. But before jumping into those, I do track my reads on StoryGraph, so I wanted to just speak to some of the stats from this month. Bear with me, I have a background in accounting and finance, so it's not super surprising that I like stats. Okay, so if you're not familiar with StoryGraph, the first graph is always like this mood pie chart. Mine are almost always like emotional and dark, like those are the top 2 pieces. I think this is the first month that it's been like fairly even, but emotional and dark are still at the top. And then as far as the pace for this month, again, it was very fast paced. I was trying to get through quite a few books in a short amount of time for the Trans Rights Readathon, so this really does make sense for me. And it does kind of go hand in hand with the page count that I had for this month as well, because for the most part, usually I'm in that 300 to 400 book range with a couple books hitting 500 plus. This month I only had 1 book that hit over 500. And the majority of the books that I read were under 300, again, because I was trying to hit as many books as possible for the Trans Rights Readathon. Now this one is unusual for me. I actually read 2 nonfiction books this month. That almost never happens. And then honestly, the most interesting chart from this month comes from the genre tracker. Since starting tracking my books on StoryGraph, there's not been a single month where romance wasn't number 1. This is the first month where romance wasn't the very top category. It was number 2, but the very top category for this month was LGBTQIA+ reads, which I'm totally okay with. I'm totally okay with that superseding the romance category. But I also just hit like so many different genres this month. It was a very fun month of reading. StoryGraph also started tracking like the tags that I do for my books, and I just find this funny now. My star rating for this month was really high. Usually I'm somewhere around like a 3 to a 3.5. This month I hit 4.05 average, and that's even more impressive given the fact that I have this 1.25 star review that is just dragging the entire group down. This graph I just always find funny because you can always tell the days that I'm like super busy with work because there's like no reading to be done. But now that is all out of the way, I have my list of all of the books that I read for this month in order from least favorite to the group of books that I'm gonna say is my top favorite, because I had quite a few 5 stars this month and I don't think I could rank them, and I won't. So my least favorite book from this month isn't gonna be super surprising if you watched my recent review of Christina Lauren books. My very first Christina Lauren book was Beautiful Bastard, and I don't know how I was so unfortunate to probably pick the worst Christina Lauren book to start with, but I found out after reading this book that this is actually their like Twilight fan fiction that was edited and then published. I have been told by quite a few people on quite a few different platforms at this point that this is the worst of the worst when it comes to Christina Lauren, and that most of their other books are much better than this. I had such a terrible time with this book though. I ended up hate reading it. Like there was just nothing romantic about this book in any way, shape, or form, even though it is supposed to be an office romance. Like, I didn't like Chloe and Bennett, but at the same time, I don't think Christina or Lauren liked Chloe and Bennett because I think they wanted me to hate them. This book was essentially just getting thrown into a toxic relationship that's just a giant HR violation. Essentially, Bennett is a nepotism baby. He is a COO at the company that his father owns, and Chloe is his intern. He's disrespectful to her. She hits him. They're in a relationship. It's a mess. Needless to say, this is my least favorite book for this month. It got 1.25 stars for me, and honestly, that's kind of generous. I think that 0.25 could probably get bumped down. The next book that I read in March was Possession by Liliana Carlisle. I had a moment at the beginning of this month where I was into dystopian wolf shifter romances. This one was at like a 3.0. star rating for me, but I think I need to bump it down because I had rated this right after reading it, and then as I was putting this list together, I realized I really didn't remember much about this book at all. It did not stand out for me. I had a good enough time while reading it, but it wasn't much different from any of the other wolf shifter dystopian romances that I've read. This is the first book in a series. The second book doesn't come out yet. I don't think it will come out until later in April or maybe May. I'm not sure if I'll continue it. Essentially what happens with this one is the alphas and omegas are separated by the government. The alphas are recruited into like a task force, and the omegas are heavily guarded within the cities and kept away from them. In exchange for the government taking care of the omegas, taking care of them, they submit clothes that they wear, which are sent to the alphas in this like militarized task force to control them through their scent. But the whole point is like this one alpha leads a rebellion and finds his omega, and they go after the government and try and get people to understand that the government is abusing them. Again, it's an interesting enough premise, but I really don't think that this series stands out much from the other dystopian wolf shifter books that I've read. Speaking of the other dystopian wolf shifter books that I've read, I also read Pretty Little Sinner by Anna Fury. This is the third book in the Northern Rejects series. The Northern Rejects is a spin-off series from the Alpha Compound series, which is also set in a dystopian Omegaverse. If you're not familiar with either of these series, there's always one book in a series that focuses on a ethical non-monogamous relationship where a couple that is already established is bringing in a third. It's part of the pack dynamic that's been established by Anna Fury in the previous series, and this book, Pretty Little Sinner, focuses on that throuple. One of the things that I do appreciate about Anna Fury and her Alpha Compound Northern Reject series is that she does make room for the idea of like something existing outside of just the typical Alpha Omega dynamic. We have alphas that are women, we have thruples, we have alphas that are not heterosexual. It's nice to see in this specific genre because I don't think it's something that we get often. But overall, I have a good time with this series. The Northern Rejects series specifically is focusing on like a rival pack, I guess, that is causing issues in like the small town that the Northern Rejects pack is also in. I have been enjoying this series. It's one that I pick up often when I'm feeling a slump coming on, so I appreciate that it always kind of pulls me through a reading slump, and it's definitely a series that I'll continue with. But these books usually fall between like 3 and 4 stars for me, so 3.25 for this one's not super surprising. The next book is Finna by Nino, Cipri, I think is how they say their last name. This is book 1 of the Littenverse series, and I have this at like 3.75 stars. This book was so fun. The only thing is like I felt like the plot like wandered a little bit and it was sometimes hard to follow, but I love the concept that is established within this world, and it gets us to book 2, which I will get to later. Finna essentially follows these 2 employees, they're ex-lovers, and they both work at Littenworld. Think IKEA. And at Littenworld, a common occurrence is that they get wormholes that you can walk through into other dimensions. And it is these 2 employees' job to follow a lost customer and bring them back through this wormhole. I found this one to be super interesting. It's really fun. I did have some issues with just like the meandering through the world. Sometimes it got like a little unclear as to what was actually happening, and I had a harder time like following what was happening. But for the most part, it was incredibly entertaining. It's a really quick read, and I had a lot of fun with it. Then I felt the need to redeem Christina Lauren because there are so many books that are apparently better than where I started with Beautiful Bastard. So then I read the Soulmate Equation because I already had this as an ebook on my Kindle. I'm not entirely sure why I bought this as an ebook, read 5 pages, put it down, never picked it back up, but that's apparently what happened, and I think that was back in like 2021. Really just like forgot about this one entirely, but I've had it for a while. So I decided this was a good time to read it, and I understand this was so much better than Beautiful Bastard. There has clearly been a lot of growth with Christina and Lauren and their writing process and their character development since their start with Beautiful Bastard. So within the Soulmate Equation, we have River and Jessica, and River is a geneticist whose company is about to go public, and they use genetics to match people up with their soulmates. Jessica and River are aware of each other just because they frequent the same coffee shop, and they go through a string of negative interactions with each other to the point where they don't really like each other at all. And then they find out through River's company that they're actually a diamond match, which is like super rare. I found this one to be really interesting because there hasn't been any other time where I've read a contemporary romance that qualifies as having the fated mates trope. This book had that, and also shed light on how uncomfortable that trope actually is when you put it in like a real world situation. And the book touched on that like intentionally. Like there was a lot of secondhand embarrassment. It really focused on like the amount of pressure that put on the relationship. Overall, I found this to be a really sweet story. I did enjoy it a lot. I gave this one like 4 stars. As part of the Trans Rights Readathon, I also read The Tea Dragon Society, and without this readathon, there's no way I would have ever picked this book up, because when do I ever read children's graphic novels? But this was so incredibly cute. Obviously, it was a super quick read, but just the concept of this is absolutely adorable, and the art within it is so incredibly sweet. Like, the moment I'm able to like buy this series for a child, I absolutely will. Essentially, this story has these tea dragons in them, and they're these beautiful tiny little creatures, and they grow tea leaves from the little antlers that they have on their heads. And then their caretakers are able to like harvest the little leaves from their antlers, make the tea, and then the tea gives them these like magical capabilities to re-experience the memories that they have with their loved ones. Just this entire concept was so incredibly adorable. And at the end of this book, there was just like a catalog of all of the different types of tea dragons, and I just sat there and reading them, being like, ooh, which tea dragon would like fit with my style the best? Like, which one would fit with my lifestyle? Like, what tea dragon would I have if I was in this world? It was just so incredibly sweet. And then one of the 2 physical books that I read this month, because for the most part they were either ebooks or audiobooks, I read Big Swiss by Jen Beagin. I had heard a lot about this one from some of my mutuals over on Book Talk that I really trust, so I picked this one up. So in the story we have Greta, and Greta is hired by a local sex therapist to transcribe his sessions with his clients. Greta ends up having like a really unhealthy attachment to one particular client, who she refers to as Big Swiss. And she ends up like unintentionally meeting Big Swiss, but then like kind of intentionally forming a friendship and then a romantic relationship with Big Swiss, which is a big deal for multiple reasons. Not only like the ethical implications of the fact that like she's essentially been like spying on Big Swiss's therapy sessions, but also the fact that like Big Swiss is only 28, whereas Greta's in her 40s. Big Swiss is also married, but with all of those like ethical complications in the way, like I still found myself rooting for Greta and Big Swiss. It's definitely like a toxic relationship, but I think this is really well done. Jen Beagin's writing style here is so entertaining. And I just love, because like I annotated this story, and I loved that like you get the transcripts that Greta writes of those therapy sessions outside of even just Big Swiss's. And so I loved that like during those therapy sessions, like I was annotating my thoughts while we were getting Greta's thoughts on them as well. Like it just felt really interactive, and I loved that. And then one of the audiobooks that I read for the Trans Rights Readathon was The Deep by River Solomon. I knew I wanted to read the audiobook version of this because it's narrated by Daveed Diggs. That was just like an immediate sell for me. And like the whole backstory of this audiobook is really interesting, because apparently like the whole concept of it started from this like instrumental album that one group came up with, and then Daveed Diggs and like his group created the song The Deep based off of the concept of that album. And then now we have like a book from River Solomon that is based on The Deep based off this album, which is just really cool. But within the story we have Yetu, and she is the historian for her people, who are the descendants of the slaves that were thrown overboard during the transatlantic slave trade. They were the children that were born to the sea and became these like mystical mermaid type beings. Being the historian for her people means that Yetu is the only one who holds the memories of her people. The rest of her community is able to forget and live freely. And then on a somewhat annual basis, Yetu performs the remembering for her people, where she helps them remember. But then after the remembering is over, they return the memories to Yetu, and no one else remembers again. I just love the way that this story specifically speaks to the impact of remembering as well as the impact of forgetting your history, and the role that community can play in the consequences of remembering or forgetting. I will definitely be getting the physical copy of this book so that I can annotate it further, but I really enjoyed this one. Then I also checked out some YA fantasy with The Witch King by H.E. Edgmon. This is an author that I hadn't read from before, but now that I have, I'll definitely be checking into their backlog. Within this world, we have witches, fae, and human, and essentially fae parents can have either witches or fae as children, but the witches are seen as other and lesser. There is a very clear commentary that is made. The author will literally just come out and tell you that witches are essentially treated the way that trans and LGBTQIA+ individuals are treated by society. So within the story, we have Wyatt. He's a trans boy who's a witch who is essentially abused by his parents, and very early on in Wyatt's childhood, his parents essentially find out that he's actually the fated mate to Prince Amir, the Fae Prince. However, Wyatt ends up running away to the human realm because of all of the different circumstances surrounding his abuse as a trans witch. And within the story, Prince Amir comes and finds him, brings him back to the Fae realm. One, because like they kind of need to get married. There's this whole like blood oath thing that if they don't, one of them will die. But also Amir's cousin is like kind of trying to usurp the throne, and so Amir is trying to get married as quickly as possible so that he can become king. This was the first book in a series. It didn't end on like a cliffhanger or anything, which I definitely appreciated, seeing as I needed to get to a million other books during the Trans Rights Readathon, but I will eventually be picking up book 2. I thought this was really entertaining, really fun, and I just think the way that the characters were written and their relationships, both platonic and romantic, were written in a really, really caring way. I just really enjoyed that aspect of this story. And then we get to the first nonfiction book in my list, which is Beyond the Gender Binary by Alok Vaid-Menon. Now, when I was putting together my TBR for the Trans Rights Readathon, I knew I wanted to include this book specifically because I had seen like a couple interviews and podcasts with Alok Vaid-Menon. If you don't know anything about this author, I highly recommend you just like give them a quick search on literally any sort of social media platform, and you'll see what I mean when I say like they're the type of person that they're so cool, and every single thing that they say, I'm just like, you know what, if you decide to write something down, I'll read it. It doesn't matter what it is. I'm absolutely signing myself up to read it. And that's exactly what happened with Beyond the Gender Binary. This is only 64 pages, but I specifically read this at like the start of the Trans Rights Readathon, and it felt like just like the perfect place to start. I think no matter where you're at, you'll get something from this book, but specifically if you're someone who's like really unfamiliar with the issues that trans and non-binary people face, this is a really good place to start getting more familiar with that. Again, it's only 64 pages, but it's highly worth your time. Okay, now we're starting to get to the point where I had a hard time rating these books because I loved all of them. But the next one is Upright Women Wanted by Sarah Gailey. This book just had such a cool concept. I'm definitely not someone who ever reads Westerns, but this book specifically took a traditional Western and flipped it on its head by instead focusing on like queer librarians who are fighting the police state that they live in by handing out unapproved materials. The librarians are the only ones who are really able to like travel throughout the country, specifically to deliver the approved materials by the state. But the specific group that we get to follow is actively fighting against that by actually distributing and passing around unapproved materials. This one was just so entertaining, and it definitely solidified that I will be reading more Sarah Gailey in the future. Okay, and then the remaining 4 books are going to be in like an order, but I'm not saying I like one more than the other at this point because they're 4 very different genres, and I absolutely loved all of them. They were all 5 stars, and they all spoke to like such different things that it's hard to even like compare them. So the first one I'm going to speak to is Heart Haunt Havoc by Freydís Moon. This is horror romance, which is maybe one of my new favorite genre mashups. Okay, so within this story, we have Colin, who's a Catholic exorcist who gets hired by Bishop to do like a cleaning on their home, because essentially Bishop's home is just filled to the brim with all of these like spirits and demons and all of these crazy things. And one of those spirits just happens to be like the demonic presence of Bishop's ex-husband. So this book clearly has like spooky vibes going on, but at the same time, the romance is so tender and sweet, and Colin has some of the best confessions. Being a Catholic, like he totally knows how to confess. Like if you are somebody who enjoyed Anthony Bridgerton's You're the Bane of My Existence but the Object of All My Desires, then I think you're absolutely going to love Heart Haunt Havoc, because Colin takes that and then some, and then Bishop gives it right back to him. The next 5-star read that I had for this month, totally changing course, and you'll be able to see why. Like I literally can't compare these 5-star reads, is Genderqueer. This one is one that I knew that I needed to get to for the Trans Rights Readathon because of the fact that it's so widely banned on like so many different banned book lists. And I knew that this was like a graphic novel before I picked it up, but I didn't realize that it was a memoir. And I also didn't realize like how much this book was going to like affect me emotionally. I think if I could compare this book to one thing, it would be the Care and Keeping of You American Girl doll book that I read as a child, which I know sounds probably kind of crazy, but just bear with me. Because the Care and Keeping of You was a book that was given to so many of us as we were growing up to prepare us for the changes that we were going to experience, and also just to let us know that like the things that we were going through were normal. They were things that other people had also been through, which made us feel not alone. And this book is aimed specifically at people who are already incredibly vulnerable. So I can only imagine what this book would mean to someone like that, which just makes me even more sad that it's frequently on the banned booked lists. Since this was a graphic novel, it was a super quick read. So if you have like a spare hour or two, highly recommend this one. Be like your little act of rebellion for the day. One of the first books that I read this month was The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This was fantastic. Just about everyone on bookish platforms has talked about this book already, but I know I'm behind with this. I knew it was gonna make me emotional, and I didn't realize how emotional it was going to make me because I just sobbed throughout all of chapter 21. That was incredibly painful. The thing that I found most impressive about this book was that I was simultaneously afraid of and afraid for almost all of the characters that I was reading about. If you're unfamiliar with this story, essentially we have Rin, and she is born as like an orphan peasant. And the entire first part of the story is Rin working her absolute hardest and spending all of her waking moments studying for this test to get to the top military academy in the country so that she isn't sold into a marriage. So it's already starting off in like a pretty dark place. And when she eventually makes it to this military academy, she starts realizing that she's like having these like powers manifest that she was not aware of. She ends up getting a mentor at this academy specifically to help her with those powers and to help her train. However, her country's on the brink of war, and essentially this war just kicks off as she's in the middle of her trainings. Again, I've only read book 1 so far of this trilogy. I immediately went out and bought book 2 and 3, but I haven't had the nerve to pick them up yet because the way book 1 ended, again, I'm afraid for and afraid of these characters. I'm very excited to eventually see where this series goes. We'll see when I have the guts to actually pick up book 2. And then the last book that I have on my list is a book that I think is gonna make like top lists for my year of reading this year, and that is Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas. This is another YA fantasy, but this was just so perfect. Within the story, we have Yadriel. He's a trans boy, and his family is gifted with these like magical powers through their god, Lady Death. And Lady Death bestows on the men the power to help guide spirits into the afterlife, and for the women, they're given healing powers. Yadriel is kind of prevented from becoming a brujo and being able to help spirits into the afterlife because his family is having a hard time accepting the fact that he's trans. However, Yadriel and his best friend end up doing the ceremony to Lady Death regardless of what his family thinks, and Lady Death ends up accepting him and granting him his powers and becoming a brujo. And like almost immediately after, Yadriel then stumbles across Julian's spirit. Julian is a boy from Yadriel's class. They don't really know each other, but they know enough to like recognize that like Julian definitely shouldn't be dead, but there he is, a ghost. So it's Yadriel's whole job to help Julian understand what happened, how he died, understand the mystery behind his death, as well as the mystery of the other people that they know went missing and were murdered around the same time as Julian, and then eventually escort Julian to the afterlife. However, throughout this entire story, they're building this incredibly sweet relationship. I actually listened to the audiobook and read the ebook for this story at the same time, and there were multiple times where I just wanted everything to slow down because I didn't want Julian to end up ever having to move to the afterlife. So I would put the ebook down without remembering that like my headphones were still in. Then I just ended up like running around the room kind of overwhelmed with like my feelings on everything, but it was so good. The tension and mystery buildup was very well done. The pace was wonderful. This literally has me so excited for everything else that Aiden Thomas has ever written and anything that is yet to come. I currently have the audiobook and the ebook for the Sunbearer Trials like at the top of my list right now. I have them both through Libby, so I will be getting to those soon. I have very high expectations after absolutely loving Cemetery Boys. That is all 15 books that I read in the month of March. I'd love to hear in a comment what your favorite book from this month is, because I am always putting together a list of a never-ending TBR. I've actually already started off April really strong with a 5-star read, which happens to be the sequel to Finna. It's called Defect, and I loved this so much. If you want to hear more about Defect, make sure to subscribe to this channel so that you can hear all about it in the next video. While you're down there, you might as well like this video. And if you've stuck around with me this far, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a beautiful, beautiful day. Mwah.